So thank you all for coming. Very nice to see such a strong turnout. My name is Lýður Þorgeirsson and I'm on the board of the Icelandic Taxpayer Alliance. On behalf of the Alliance and the Icelandic Research Center for Innovation and Economic Growth, known in Iceland as RNH, and the Alliance of European Conservatives and Reformists, I'm honored to introduce Mr. Matthew Elliott. Matthew is best known for being the founder of the UK's Taxpayers Alliance in 2004, and has built it to become one of the most influential non-partisan political grassroots organization in the UK. Everyone in the UK knows the TPA. It has a staff of 15 full-time campaigners, about 80,000 supporters and a very broad donor base. Matthew also founded the Big Brother Watch to campaign for civil and personal liberties. The Big Brother Watch has in very short time become one of the highest profile commentators on privacy and civil liberties in the UK. Yeah. The campaign focuses its efforts on research in exposing the erosion of civil liberties in the UK, such as the absurd expansion of government surveillance power and what is often referred to as the database state. Matthew has also written several books on wasteful public spending and has a degree in government from London School of Economics. So for anyone interested in learning the best practices on how to influence and shape public discourse and policy, listening to Matthew will be a treat. If anyone knows how to sway the pendulum from ever larger government and higher taxes to liberty and lower taxes and less bureaucracy, it's this guy. We hope we will have time for questions after Matthew's presentation, and I intend to end the meeting at 1 o'clock sharp. Matthew, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here, and one of the, I think the best achievements of the Taxpayers Alliance has been to help influence taxpayer groups overseas, and it gives me great delight that there have been groups set up in Iceland, and there's an Australian Taxpayers Alliance, and even in America somebody has now taken our name to form the Taxpayers Protection Alliance, another TPA. So it's going to be a great pleasure to see the growth of taxpayer groups across the world thanks to some of the work that we've been doing. And it's great to be here to tell you a little bit about that story. Now, I'm primarily a campaigner rather than a policy wonk, if you like. So I'm going to tell you more about setting up the Taxpayers Alliance, why I did it, what influence it's had, rather than the ins and outs of Britain's quite complicated tax system. So you can see there one of our rallies which took place shortly after the 2010 general election in the UK. And there'd been a big trade union rally saying that the new government shouldn't be cutting spending, that they shouldn't be going through with an austerity package. And we basically organised a rally with our big UK debt clock in the background to basically make the case that it was right that there were spending cuts, that the UK was spending too much money, and that the only way out of the financial situation which the UK found itself in, along with many other countries in the 2010, was to start cutting government spending and cutting taxes. So that was perhaps one of the great achievements of the TPA. But it goes back nearly 10 years now. Next year is our 10th anniversary, and just to give you a flavour of where I was when I founded it, I was age 25. I studied at the London School of Economics, and after that worked for a number of members of Parliament and members of the European Parliament. And I sort of seen government from the inside, if you like. But I felt there was a great niche there for a taxpayer group. And before I start my presentation, I just want to give you a bit of a big picture about politics in the UK. And that is that people are still very much interested in politics. It's just the way in which they engage in politics is very different than it was decades ago. So in the 1950s, the major political parties in the UK had about 3 million members each. So the Conservative Party and the Labour Party both had over 3 million members apiece. So it's quite a regular thing to be a member of a political party. And now they've just come out with the statistics. The Conservative Party in the UK now has just 130,000 members, and the British Labour Party now has just 170,000 members. So that's been a huge decline in membership of political parties. And some people, when they hear about that decline, they say, well, this suggests that people aren't interested in politics anymore. And I would actually challenge that, because at the same time as this decline in political parties, you've seen a big increase in the number of people taking part in basically single-issue pressure groups. Now, the Taxpayers Alliance is perhaps the most famous example of a pressure group on the centre-right of British politics. Other ones on the centre-right would include groups like the Countryside Alliance, which campaigns for rural issues and campaigns in favour of hunting. But more broadly in politics, you have many types of single-issue pressure groups. You have pressure groups like Friends of the Earth and like Greenpeace. And I would say that political activism now, certainly in Britain, and I see this in the rest of the world as well, is now mainly through pressure groups rather than through political parties. So it's tapping into that theme which has been the growth of the Taxpayers Alliance. Now, why is the Taxpayers Alliance successful? Now, this lady here, you probably don't recognise her. She's a very famous centre-left journalist in the UK. She writes for the Guardian newspaper, which is one of the broadsheets in the UK, perhaps probably the most influential broadsheet in the UK, because it's read by so many BBC journalists. And she said about us recently, drip, 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 day after day, an insidious poison is fed into the nation's veins. And that actually is perhaps a pretty good description of what we do at the Taxpayers Alliance. I won't put it quite like that, but what we try and do is put out research papers and put out facts into the public domain about the true scale of government spending and taxation in the UK. And we try and do that in such a way that's newsworthy. Now, you'll have come across lots of think tanks before, and think tanks have done historically very, very good work, and we ourselves come up with some pretty hefty tomes. This is a report we put out. This is very unusual, by the way. We put out this report 2 years ago called the Single Income Tax, and this was the result of a 2-year commission which we'd done, a tax commission, working out how to change Britain's tax system. But if you publish a report like this, it can be very influential with policymakers and with civil servants and with government ministers, because if you take the time, you can actually explain the ideas behind your thinking to them in big reports like this. But if you want to change the way in which a nation thinks, you need to put things into bite-sized chunks. And I think that's what we've been really good at the Taxpayers Alliance. We've translated some fairly sort of hefty concepts like single income taxes and flat taxes and Laffer curves and what have you into things which are much more easily digestible by the public and by the media. So I would say that publications like Burning Our Money, about wastes of taxpayers' money, that's a much better way to get through to the population. Or you can see some of the examples in, perhaps you've picked up one of these little green books which we hand out to members of the public. If you flick to the back, you can see on page 28 various examples of wasteful spending. And when taxpayers read that, you can see the first example here, that £230,000 of taxpayers' money is spent by politicians on a selection of paintings and statues or busts to adorn their offices. That's the sort of thing that gets people really annoyed, because to the politician, they think, well, we've got a right to have these paintings and these statues in our offices. But to the ordinary taxpayer who've worked really hard to actually pay their taxes and bring money home to the family, they get really frustrated, as do I, when I sort of see that sort of wasteful spending happening. And what it also shows is that when politicians say that the country can't afford tax cuts, that if you have to bring in tax cuts, that will mean that will hit vital public services like healthcare and education, the taxpayer can turn around and say, well, what about these wasteful things you're doing? So that's been a very powerful thing we've done and something which Polly Toynbee has picked up on. Now, what's our objective? We basically believe that taxes should be simple, fair and low, that as much money should be left in taxpayers' pockets as possible, and we want to spend supporting their own families, their own communities and their own cause. And that, in a nutshell, is what the Taxpayers Alliance stands for. And to anybody who's familiar with free market philosophy or classical liberal philosophy or sort of libertarian philosophy, these are very sort of themes which run through all of those schools of thought. But we believe that the Taxpayers Alliance is a far better way to achieve that objective for society than setting up yet another think tank. That it's better to influence society through short reports about wasteful spending than it is through long reports about changing the tax system in lots of detail. Now, how do we campaign? We go into this in more detail in the annual review, which some of you will have picked up on. But we first start off with rigorous research, so we do make sure that we know the facts. So we do publications like this, so when we talk to people, we can say we're on top of the facts, so we're not superficial in any way. But research also involves one thing which I take a great interest in, and that's understanding public opinion. And I think we're one of the few groups in the UK outside of the political parties to actually do proper polling and proper focus groups to actually work out which arguments are most effective when it comes to explaining our mission. Now, it's all very well, if you're delivering a lecture, the sort of arguments that may turn people on or may convince people in a lecture theatre are very different often to the arguments that will convince people when it comes to members of the public and voters. And it's really important for a campaign group's point of view that we get out of our policy wonk ivory tower and we stop using the complicated intellectual arguments that may be great at universities and in think tanks and what have you, and actually come up with snappier, more convincing arguments that would actually convince members of the public and ultimately voters. Because if you want change, you've got to convince the voters, because by convincing the voters, you then convince politicians to actually carry out what you do. So we do research. We then try and get media coverage because we get our ideas out through the media. And I'd say we're one of the most high-profile pressure groups in the UK, now getting about 1,000 mainstream media hits in newspapers, TV, radio. That's excluding internet, about 1,000 every month. And then that feeds into all of the other areas of campaigning that we do. So we start by getting the facts and presenting them in an accessible format. Then we convey the information to millions through print and broadcast media. And then we make it count through ongoing campaigns. You can see a bit more about our research here. And we're now very, very keen on infographics. So we find these are a very good way of convincing people. Not only using them in little booklets like this, but also disseminating them through the internet. I would say the growth of the internet has perhaps been the biggest change in my time as a campaigner. When I first got involved in after university, so that would be back in 2000, it was my first job in a think tank. I remember the think tank still had an AOL email address. And I think it barely had a website, and it was all very sort of low tech, and we sent out press releases to journalists via fax. Now, of course, all of that was hugely expensive, and now politics has really changed through the growth of the internet, and we've tried to capture that by coming up with infographics and what have you, which in campaigns, which we can use social media to really get it out there. The other key thing we've done, and we've perhaps led on this in the UK, is to use the Freedom of Information Act, which Tony Blair brought in, to actually find out more about government spending. And we put down literally thousands of freedom of information requests every year to find out how the government is spending our money. And then, of course, we put those facts out into the media. And from a journalist's point of view, I would say it's very powerful when another group has done lots of freedom of information requests, because they know that they can trust those facts, because those facts have been supplied by the government. Then, of course, we get the media coverage. You can see some of the front pages we've got here. We're trying to do more and more in terms of documentaries as well. So we work with some of the leading documentary makers in the UK to try and get our facts out through them. We're not bothered if we get credit for that. We're just happy for our ideas to get on mainstream television. So you can see on the right-hand side there, Britain's £1 trillion horror story featured lots of examples from the various publications that we've put out. The one at the top was particularly good. MPs spend £400,000 on 12 trees for offices. And again, that just really frustrates people and really sort of conveys our argument quite nicely. I'll come on to the beer tax campaign later. Now, unlike most other groups in the UK, we actually have an active grassroots network too. And why are grassroots important? Again, it goes back to the fact that politicians are ultimately influenced by their voters. We very strongly believe that if we can get voters in local areas to convince their local representatives to change their minds, that's a very, very powerful thing, much more powerful than us lobbying them directly from Westminster. So we organise about 2 grassroots events every week somewhere in the country, and usually these grassroots events coincide with one of our major campaigns. One campaign I'm going to come on to later was our beer tax campaign, which was successful. And you can see in the top left-hand corner there, a group of students with our beer tax mats. You can also see at the bottom, you may be wondering what the man is in the bottom middle with his big cartoon figure. That cartoon figure is the cartoon of the tax collector which the government uses. So we often take him on tour around the country, and he's great for photo ops. And of course, again, it sort of fits in that whole idea of people wanting to use Facebook and Twitter and what have you. People want their photograph taken with him. They then disseminate it through their networks. It just gets our message out there to the public. So beer tax in the UK was on what they call a beer tax escalator, which meant that the tax just went up every year in a similar way that traditionally petrol tax in the UK or fuel tax has gone up every year. And we wanted to stop this. We thought it would be a very populist campaign. Why on earth should people be paying more for their beer when they pay so much already? So we came up with a whole campaign around the concept of the idea that a third of a pint of beer is actually tax. And isn't it disgraceful that a third of the pint of beer is tax? This really caught on, and some of you may be thinking, why on earth go for beer tax? Why not go straight for the big taxes like income tax or corporation tax or what have you? We do a lot of work in those areas as well, but I think part of our challenge is getting people used to the idea of how much tax they pay. So, for example, students, you'll often get students saying, well, we don't pay any tax, we're students, we don't pay income tax. But then getting them used to the idea that they pay tax when they buy a pint of beer, that they pay VAT or sales tax, if you like, when they go shopping. They may pay council tax as well. You just get them used to the idea that they are taxpayers giving their money to the government. That's very important going forward when it comes to changing the minds of the country. We also did a campaign on business rates as well. And again, you may think with business rates that would be purely targeted at businessmen. But again, we were able to get grassroots activists out to campaign on business rates, because business rates, as we explained to them, increase the cost of goods in their shops and also lead to lots of empty properties in city centres, especially during times of recession, which in turn lead to further problems. So we managed to popularise what was quite a niche issue with that Freeze Business Rates campaign, And that was another campaign which looks like it will be successful. You can see a map of our supporters across the country there, so we're fairly well spread out geographically. You can see Scotland at the top, slightly cut off. Not many people live in Scotland, so there are a few activists there, but lots more in the southeast where many people live in the UK. And one of the great things which we've done in recent years is really bring along our grassroots. So now there are proper grassroots coordinators, proper ways of engaging with them. And we were less good at that in the past, but that's one of the great achievements in the past few years. This presentation actually geared more towards donors rather than lectures like this. But it's worth explaining this one because we've actually made one of our big themes at the moment pressure on living standards, because that's a big issue to lots of people. You may have heard that it looks like there are signs that basically the economy in the UK is starting to turn round, albeit very, very slowly. There's still lots of quantitative easing going on, lots of printing money going on, which some people might say is artificially getting the economy going. And so it's not a real recovery yet, but there are signs that things are starting to turn round. But a lot of it hasn't actually got through to the average man on the street. So what we're doing is actually going to really sort of target the idea of living standards and the idea of how overtaxation is hitting people's living standards, how things like heating bills and electricity bills are going up thanks to various green taxes which the government's imposing, how people are spending more on petrol thanks to the fact that fuel taxes are going up. So again, making it very, very focused on how it affects ordinary people rather than some of the more sort of highfalutin, airy-fairy ideas about the economy generally, personalising it down to the voter in order to actually get them to really focus on it when it comes to the next general election in 2015. I talked briefly before about wasteful spending, and it's perhaps worth turning to this document here. I don't know if you picked this one up, but this is a document we came out with. Perhaps a few more could be handed out if people haven't got it. This is our signature document, if you like. It's actually been made into a book, but we update it regularly with sort of longer publications like this. And what we try and do is actually work out how the government could actually cut spending. Because one of the big arguments against tax cuts, like I touched on before, is that the country can't afford it. What politicians will often say is that if you cut taxes, how will we pay for hospitals, how will we pay for schools, how will we pay for the things that people actually want from the government. So what we do every year is come up with a bumper book of government waste, which is our sort of signature publication at the TPA, goes back 10 years now. And we actually work out how in the last financial year, 11-12, we worked out that we felt that £120 billion, that's out of government spending of about 700 billion, just to put it in context. About £120 billion was wasted in that year, which is equivalent to £4,500 for every household in the UK. And we try and get people into the idea of what could you have done with an extra £4,500 in your pocket. Perhaps you could go on holiday. That's why we've got hammock on the front page. Perhaps you'd have more money to go towards your weekly shop. Or perhaps you have more money to pay for your gas and electricity bills, which are going up massively in the UK, which are a huge concern to lots of people. And if you look at, just flick forward a little bit. This is to, it's to the second page too. I redid this PDF. This goes on for many, many pages, and it's available on our website, taxpayersalliance.com. And you can see that one of the biggest areas of waste, in our view, is the overpaying of people in the public sector. Now, let me just explain that. It's worth me touching on that, because that sounds quite controversial. Why are people in the public sector overpaid? And again, this goes back to the history over the past 20 years. I think if you go back to the early 1990s in the UK, I think it's fair to say that people in the public sector were generally underpaid compared to people working in the private sector by quite a long way. And the idea was that they were underpaid well, but they got good pensions compared to people in the private sector. They tended to get better holidays as well, and they tended to have better job security. That made up for the fact they were underpaid in the public sector. And what we saw from the mid-1990s right through to 2007, 2008 was a big increase in public sector spending in the UK. And a lot of that public sector spending basically went on pay rises for people working in the public sector. And you got to a situation where people in the public sector were actually being paid a lot more than people in the private sector, as well as getting on top of that better pensions, better job security, better holidays. And we've worked out using figures from the Chartered Institute for Public Management, so proper statistics, that actually if you paid people in the public sector the equivalent of what they would get paid in the private sector for the same type of job, you actually save a massive £53 billion a year in the UK. And that's why we've been urging the government not to cut public sector wages. I think that'd be quite controversial from an electoral point of view, but to basically freeze it and keep them frozen until they basically get back in sync with private sector wages in order to be able to save some money. We looked into other issues there as well. You can see public sector fraud, £20 billion a year of waste. Inefficient public sector procurement is another big one. These are the things like big IT projects and big building contracts the government undertakes, which tend to go up much more in cost over the course of their time span than they would in the private sector. And that's often because some of the sort of rigorous approach to procurement which you have in the private sector isn't translated into the public sector. So those are a few of the bigger examples of what we call wasteful spending. I talked briefly before about the single income tax report. This is our mission to actually get the single income tax in the UK. How we're doing that is quite interesting because essentially what the single income tax is in a nutshell is basically the idea that however you get your income, whether it's from a salary or from rental income or from dividend income, should we pay the same tax rate. So it's basically tax neutral about however you pay your income, which makes a lot of sense. And how we get that enacted is quite a tough one because it's quite a radical idea. But interestingly, I don't know if you've had it over here, but there have been lots of scandals in recent years about tax avoidance and by the likes of Google and Amazon and Starbucks. And some of these cases have more slightly sort of blown up by the media in many ways. But this whole idea of tax avoidance is quite a big one. And what we say in response to that is not to hike up taxes on businesses. That's not the way to actually get more revenue in from business. The way to do it is actually to simplify the tax system. By simplifying it, you get rid of some of the loopholes which different businesses take advantage of. And actually by lowering the tax rate, you'll actually get more taxation in because more businesses will declare more. So that was another. I'll play this cartoon. There's no sound on this, but I'll just briefly explain it to you. We try to use little cartoons like this, first of all because they go viral, but secondly because it sort of tries to simplify quite a complex idea. At the moment, tax is hugely complicated because if you, on your income tax, you pay income tax plus employers' national insurance plus employees' national insurance. That's what it gets spent on. And what we're arguing is that actually all those rates should be combined together so people actually see the real rate of income tax. And we're saying, why don't we just call it what it is? It's tax. So we're calling for the abolition of national insurance, which is a sort of a payment towards welfare, if you like. But basically you can't choose whether or not you pay it, you have to pay it. We're saying it should be combined into income tax to make one flat rate of tax. People actually really see what they are paying. Sorry we didn't have the sound on that. We've got more campaigns coming up over the next few years. Campaigns on energy taxes, work for the dole, which is the idea that if you're on benefits, you should have to do some form of training or some form of voluntary work. And we've got a stamp duty campaign, which is very popular because lots of people are trying to buy and sell houses at the moment, and stamp duty stops them doing that. We're trying to tackle the NHS, the National Health Service, and looking at some of the examples of wasteful spending there. looking into the funding of trade unions by the government, because the trade unions are some of the people who are campaigning most ferociously against spending cuts. So we're going to try look at this, how the government funds them, and also public sector pensions. And that's it. That's about the taxpayers' line. So I'm willing to take any questions, especially on taxpayers' lines itself, but also any questions on British politics, or any questions on how we go about campaigning other campaigns like Big Brother Watch. Or the one we didn't mention was the No to AV referendum campaign. Britain's second nationwide referendum 2 years ago, which I led. And we turned around public opinion from being 2-1 in favour of change to 2-1 against. And some of the examples of how we use communication there was quite interesting too. Thank you.
Thank you.